Hello everyone, this week's network security course topic is application layer security. So I have divided our topics into 5 parts, but actually they are not equally divided. But we will start with OWASP top 10 application security risks, and my plan is to actually finish this video after this point. But in the following part I will talk about some application layer security, about some protocols like SMTP, which we use the electronic mail, and then DNS, and we will talk about some DNS attacks. Then I'm planning to talk about denial of service attacks at the application layer, then HTTP flood attack and slow loris, and to finish this week's topics. So the goal of this week's is actually to become familiar with recent web application security issues published in OWASP reports, learn about further application layer protocols like SMTP and DNS, and learn about denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks at the application layer. So let's start with OWASP. So OWASP is actually Open Web Application Security project, and this project publishes some analysis in some years. The latest one is at 2017, and I just checked if the website, if it is updated, but the top 10 list is the same today as it was in 2017. So the major security problem of our day is users can supply arbitrary input. These can be request parameters, HTTP headers, cookies, etc. But main problem actually comes from the request parameters, because in early web pages there were only static HTMLs, so user didn't provide any parameters. So at the time there weren't much security risks. But later on, when we are allowed the users to input some parameters, like when creating an account, they have to enter their name, username, and choose a password and so on, or when they are logging in, they provide their credentials. But here there should be a good checking mechanism to see to overcome this problem, because users may misbehave and provide invalid parameters to attack the server actually, and we will talk about them in a minute. So this is Open Web Application Security Project. This foundation is a non-profit organization, and their goal is the cybersecurity awareness to develop trusted applications. So you can check the web page, you can even find more information about this top 10 application security risks. And OWASP itself considers their top 10 list as simple security problems, and let's see what this list is. Again, this list is from 2017, but I just checked and it is the same today. So from first one to the last one, these are injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, XML external entities, broken access control, security misconfiguration, cross-site scripting, insecure deserialization, using components with known vulnerabilities, insufficient logging and monitoring. And we will talk about them, all of them, in a few sentences and give a few short examples that how these are actually observed in practice. But let's compare the 2017 list with 2013 one. This actually tells us what has changed in the recent years and what are no longer considered as the top security risks. And as you can see, some of the attack types are merged, but some of the new attacks emerged since 2013 to 2017. So they made it to the top 10 list. As you can see here, XML external entities, insecure deserialization, and insufficient logging and monitoring became in the top 10 list in 2017. And as I told you, this list hasn't been changed today, so it is the same. So let's start with the injection. So the thing is, untrusted data is sent to an interpreter as part of a command or query. The attacker's hostile data can trick the interpreter into executing unintended commands or accessing data without proper authorization. So injection can be done to any platform, but most of the time basic examples come from SQL injection, because many web page uses a database. When they receive input from the user, the server actually performs some operations and then checks some data at the database. So the user's input is actually used in an SQL command. And if you don't know what an SQL command is, this is just, for instance, in this code, we are trying to, so you can think database is just tables where columns are appear here. So in this case, there's a column where users' names are listed. So here the SQL command just checks if the user ID and the username matches the database. So here, when the user trying to log in, they have to enter the username and password. But if the user provides more data, like or 1 equals to 1, which is always true, so in this case, the select command will perform because this is always true. So it will select the user from the list, or if it is going to print something on the screen this way, you can trick the server to print everything in this table on the screen. So since in the commands most of the time we are using quotation marks, users can also provide some input values where it also contains quotation marks. So actually this can easily be overcome, but by the way, they are using this quotation mark here so that they cancel this name part here and provide some data afterwards. So this way they always provide a valid tree command to get it from the database. And LDAP injection, which is the short for the lightweight directory access protocol used for authentication, is a directory service protocol that runs on a layer above the TCP/IP stack, and a similar LDAP injection attacks can be performed for the LDAP, which looks like very similar to the SQL injection. So here's a picture where it is given an example. Normally when the user provides some input, it should appear like this, but malicious user can put some scripting code inside. This way the server runs this JavaScript and maybe leak some information and so on. So similar thing can happen for the OS injection. The class below is used to execute some native executable, like do stuff exe on the application server via the Java lang runtime static method get runtime and return a result. So here, as you can see, the username is provided an input string, and then it tries to run this executable. But there's a problem here. The problem is that the username, which is this one, parameter, is not validated prior to calling the method. So this way an injection can be performed, like an example is provided here. Okay. So how do you prevent it? The main actually way to prevent is to validate input, but let's start from the first one. Avoid returning detailed error messages. This is really important, and actually this is valid for almost every attack type, not only for the injection but almost everything. The thing is that detailed error messages give information about the system, and this is a huge problem, and this happens almost all the time. It happens even when you travel around. You can see at LCD screens that you can see very detailed error messages, or at the ATM machines you can see almost every file name on the device and so on when they give an error. So this is a huge error, because if you have detailed information about the system, this way you can know how to attack the system, because most of the time you don't know. For instance, let's go back to the SQL injection. You are providing an input here, but you don't know what the interpreter will try to do with your data, because you don't know inside information. So you can try a lot of stuff, but most of the time you fail. But if you know what the code is, then you can perform the attack better. So this is why you shouldn't leak information about your system. But detailed error messages leaks a lot of information. So this is why you have to be careful about this. Actually, after debugging period, you should never actually provide any information at your error messages. The next thing you should do is to validate input. You can have blacklist versus whitelist, and you need to check, regular expressions or on simple patterns and so on. So the idea here is to actually prevent users to provide input like quotation marks and so on. This is why when you're creating an account, your username cannot contain many special characters, because this way you can actually break the database. So you should escape the input. And you should also have parameterized queries. Instead of using this kind of quotation marks in your SQL commands, maybe you should just convert it to parameterized queries and so on. So the second in our list is broken authentication. Due to incorrect implementation, by the way, maybe I should go back and tell one more thing about this validating user input. In this case, we are talking about injection, but many different kind of attacks can be performed by the user input. For instance, when first web page moved from the static data to dynamic data, for instance, when the first forms are created, users are allowed to provide an avatar picture. So you can upload a profile picture to your account. So initially people didn't check this user data. So, and initially, I'm talking about maybe 15 or 20 years ago, or actually 30 maybe. So the web hosting websites actually had very limited storage at those times. Maybe you have like 100 megabytes or something. So in those days, people uploaded fake 100 megabytes of JPEG images to this web page to stop them functioning, because their storage will be run out and none of the changes will be performed in the server side. So you have to check user input for every possible kind of attacks. You have to check the size of the image, you have to check the file size, but also the resolution and so on. So this validating user input is not just for injection, but you have to validate it for many different kinds of attacks. Okay, so let's move on to broken authentication. Due to incorrect implementation of application functions related to authentication and session management. So attackers may compromise passwords, keys, or session tokens to assume other users' identities temporarily or permanently. One example is credential stuffing. Automated injection of breach username password pairs into websites until they are potentially matched to an existing account, also known as automated web injection. So you have a compromised server, so the user tries to log in with this stolen credentials, and then actually, so these credentials are stolen by the compromised server. Then you can use those credentials to log into maybe to the Gmail and so on, and check if the username and password is also valid there and so on. And people are using same username for almost every web page and same password for every web page, which is not something that we suggest. We always suggested to users to use different password for every web page, every different web page, but this is today is not feasible, because we have to create a lot of accounts for a lot of different web pages. So maybe it is better to divide your passwords into levels. If you are using a credit card or something, you should have a very secure password for that, and maybe for some other web pages you can choose some other password and so on. So one is broken, you only lose accounts at that level web pages, let's say. In our list, the third one is sensitive data exposure. Inappropriate protection of sensitive data, for example financial or healthcare, by web applications and APIs. Attackers may steal or modify data to conduct credit card fraud, identity theft, etc. Here's an example. An application encrypts credit card numbers in a database using automatic database encryption. However, This data is automatically decrypted when retrieved, allowing an SQL injection flow to retrieve credit card numbers in clear text. So you should be very careful about using database encryption. This kind of attacks can happen. Another example is, for instance, a site doesn't use or enforce TLS for all pages. So this happens today also, but years ago Facebook was also not forcing you to use TLS, for instance. So idea is as follows. An attacker monitors network traffic, for example at an insecure wireless network. He or she downgrades connection from HTTPS to HTTP, intercepts requests and steals the user's session cookie. The attacker then replaces this cookie and hijacks the user's authenticated session, accessing or modifying the user's private data. So this is important. So you have to always check. For instance, many social web pages, just like Facebook or Twitter, forces you to use HTTPS. Even if you write to your browser HTTP, / and then twitter.com, the server will force you to the HTTPS version, so you cannot connect to these web pages in an insecure way. And here, the HTTPS uses TLS here. And if you want to do the same thing at your web pages, for instance, as the Apache server, you just write a simple one-line command at the .htaccess file, which forces all of those domain or codomains to force to move to HTTPS, even if the user just types HTTP to their browser. Another example is that the password database uses unsalted or simple hashes to store passwords. We talk about it a lot when we were talking about hash functions, so we know that a file upload download flow allows an attacker to retrieve the password database. It always happens. Almost every database is leaked at least once in history, so this is why we talk about that we have to use hashes. So we have to use salts, but we have to use hashes, but we have to repeat the hash process maybe at least 1000 times and so on, to make it harder for the attackers to perform brute force attacks. Unsalted hashes can be exposed with a rainbow table of pre-calculated hashes. Hashes generated by, we talk about this is actually a dictionary attack. Moreover, hashes generated by simple or fast hash functions may be cracked by GPUs, even if they were salted. So we already talked about this, but when you ask for your password from a web server and the server sends you your password by email, this means that they keep your password in their database unhashed. So this is a very huge problem, and it's 2020, but still this thing happens, So this is still a huge problem for people who doesn't know cryptographic hash functions or how to use them. Okay, let's move on to fourth one, which is XML external entities. Older poorly configured XML processors evaluate external entity references within XML documents. External entities can be used to disclose internal files, file shares, perform remote code execution, and so on. For example, an authorized user changes a parameter value which directly refers to an object to another object the user isn't authorized for. So automated crawlers can find all directly accessible files in the system. So this is important because some people think that if they put a file to their folder in their web page, and they sometimes give very strange names to these files so that nobody can guess them, and they think that they are secure, and sometimes they even put passwords into these text documents, but automated crawlers can find those files because most of the time users never configure their server so that to prevent this kind of crawlers. So you have to be very careful about this kind of attacks. Of course, there are other ways of attacking, like methods of uploading a malicious XML file if accepted. In this example, the attacker attempts to extract data from the server. by giving this kind of header where they're trying to reach the password file. An attacker probes the server's private network by changing the above entity line to this. Or an attacker attempts a denial of service attack by including a potential endless file, so that the server tries to read this file, but it takes a lot of time. But this is a topic that you can easily read on Wikipedia, because it's easy but also important topic where you can have a lot of information just from the Wikipedia. Okay, let's move on to fifth one, which is broken access control. Exploitation of access control is the problem here. Inappropriate enforcement on the restrictions on what authenticated users are allowed to do. For example, an attacker may force the browser to target URLs. Admin rights are required for access to the admin page. If an unauthenticated user can access either page, it's a flaw. If a non-admin can access the admin page, this is a flaw. So actually this kind of thing happens. I observe this kind of behavior most of the time when people try to install an application to their web page. For instance, they want to use like a Wikipedia web page, or they want to install a forum or portal or something like this. So they don't know the open source code, they upload it to their web page. So at that point, since they are reaching their web page from outside, most of the admin files or folders can be accessed from outside. So you need to do this to install the application in the first place. But after you install them, you have to prevent others to reach these folders without the proper authentication. But most of the people don't do this. So most of the time, if you just write the app then admin, and if they're not prevented this folder from access from unauthorized people, then you can directly access the admin control panel and so on. So this is a kind of an example for broken access, but it's also misconfiguration. Another example is the lack of data verification in SQL. So here is an example. The following code accesses account information by using unverified data in a SQL call. So in this case, there is a parameter act. So most probably this parameter is defined someplace above in the code. But what is forgotten here is that here it is not checked. So it is not verified. So the attacker may force this account variable to something different, like for instance write admin or something. So this way they can connect to an account which they are not, which doesn't belong to them. So an attacker modifies the ACK parameter in the browser to send whatever account number they want. If not properly verified, the attacker can access any user's account in this way. We talk about this kind of accesses when we were talking about GET and POST methods at HTTP. Okay, so how to prevent it? Do not assume that users will be unaware of special or hidden URLs or APIs. Block access to all file types that your application should never serve. If you have for instance, a folder for passwords, or you have this kind of folders, you have to prevent them to be accessed from outside. You have to block them. So far we talk about the first 5 of them. So remaining 5 risks are in our top 10 list are as follows. So we will continue with security misconfiguration. So security misconfiguration is the most commonly seen issue, commonly a result of insecure default configurations, incomplete or ad hoc configurations, open class storage, misconfigured HTTP headers, verbose error messages containing sensitive information. So in this case, patching and upgrading also needed. Moreover, most of the time, even if you have configured everything in a correct way, if you are using some application written by other people, then when there is a patch or a new version is available, you upgrade your application, but now these configurations may change due to your upgrade. So you have to also check every version and see if your configuration is correct. Attackers often attempt to exploit unpatched flows or access default accounts, unused pages, unprotected files and directories. An example is as follows. The application server comes with sample applications that are not removed from the production server. These sample applications may have known security flaws attackers use to compromise the server. If one of these applications is the admin console and default accounts weren't changed, the attacker logs in with default passwords and takes over. Another example is as follows. The application server's configuration allows detailed error messages, for example stack traces, to be returned to users. This potentially exposes sensitive information or underlying flaws such as component versions that are known to be vulnerable. So this is important. For instance, when I'm writing code, most of the time I always report errors fully by saying which SQL command actually provided this error and at which line in the code and so on, because this way I can debug the code. But once I finalize the application, I never print anything on the screen, so your error messages should not contain any detailed error afterwards when it is allowed for public access. So the seventh one in our list is cross-site scripting. XSS is the second most prevalent issue in the OWASP top 10 and is found in around 2/3 of all applications. XSS allows attackers to execute scripts in the victim's browser, which can hijack user sessions, deface websites, or redirect users to malicious sites. So this kind of flaws occur whenever an application includes untrusted data in a new web page without proper validation or escaping, an application updates an existing web page with user-supplied data using a browser API that can create HTML or JavaScript. So here's an example. The application uses untrusted data in the construction of the following HTML snippet without validation or escaping. So here there is a parameter called CC. The attacker modifies the CC parameter in the browser to this. As you can see, this actually now directs the user to a CGI code. So this attack causes the victim session ID to be sent to the attacker's website, allowing the attacker to hijack the user's current session. So CC parameter is actually the current session, so this way the attacker can capture it. In our list, the eighth one is insecure deserialization. Serialization is the process of turning some object into a data format, like JSON or XML, that can be restored later. People often serialize objects in order to save them to storage or to send as part of communications, and the deserialization is the reverse of that process, taking data structured from some format and rebuilding it into an object. So you read, for instance, read the JSON file and then turn it into an object. But insecure deserialization often leads to remote code execution. Exploitation of deserialization is somewhat difficult. For instance, here is an example. A PHP forum uses PHP object serialization to save a super cookie containing the user's ID, role, password, hash, and other state. So in this case, instead of retrieving this data from the database when connecting, this web page, this PHP forum, saves all of this information in the cookie of the user. So in your computer, you have this. In your cookie you have this kind of information which actually has your username. Also it states that you are a user, but the cookie is on your computer, so you can modify it as you want. So in our example, the attacker changes the serialized object to give themselves admin privileges by changing user to admin and changing the username here. So this way, if this deserialization is not correct, and you can have an admin access. And the ninth one is the using components with known vulnerabilities. For example, components typically run with same privileges as the application itself. Flaws in any component can result in serious impact. Some example exploitable component vulnerabilities discovered are, For instance, there's a CVE here, and Apache Struts 2 remote code execution vulnerability. This is an open source web application framework for developing Java EE web applications. The vulnerability enables the execution of arbitrary code on the server. While Internet of Things are frequently difficult or impossible to patch, the importance of patching them can be great. So IoT security is a hot resource topic. So this is actually important because, I mean, for us, other than this example, let me check if we have more example. No. So using components with known vulnerabilities is really a big problem. For instance, if you install the application, for instance, you like a forum and you downloaded them, installed it in your web page, then you have to update it whenever there is a patch for it, because most of the time when you visit a web page you can see that which version of that forum you are using and so on at the bottom of the page. But if there is a vulnerability for that version, people can, from the CVEs can know that which version has this kind of vulnerabilities, and just Google it, the version number, and then check if which people hasn't updated it yet, and then perform this attack. So using components with known vulnerabilities is actually, in this list it is in the NINT one, but the impact might be bigger than the other vulnerabilities, because many vulnerabilities in this kind of things give full access to the attacker and so on. So it is really important. You have to always check the CVEs and, patch and upgrade all of your applications. And finally, in our list, the 10th one is insufficient logging and monitoring. This is really important because studies shows that most breach studies show time to detect a breach is over 200 days. So most of the time a company or a organization has a breach, but they realize it 200 days later. And typically, most of the time these are detected by external parties rather than internal processes or monitoring. So you learn that you are attacked by some other people, a few hundred days later. So this is mostly because of insufficient logging and monitoring. Okay. So I think these are our top 10. So in our next video I will continue talking about some protocols like SMTP and DNS.